Dear friends, dear colleagues, it's 4 o'clock in Europe, and I welcome you to this webinar, Reshaping the Library with Opportunities and Possibilities in the Light of the COVID pandemic. I'm aware that we have a very broad international audience, so for those in the East, it is already evening, and those in the West, it's good morning. So good evening and good morning to you. This webinar is jointly organized by OCLC and EBLIDA, and I'm Ton van Vlimmeren, the president of EBLIDA, and I have the honor to be your host today. We see in many Western countries, after about 18 months of COVID pandemic, that it seems to be declining and on its way back. And of course, we are aware that this is in the countries that were wealthy enough and privileged to be able to vaccinate a substantial part of their population, and that not all countries were in the same position, and there's a lot of work to be done yet. So what the pandemic at least has shown is that inequality in the world is there, and that it even has become bigger due to the pandemic. But at the same time, after 18 months, it is a moment that we can look back and try to see what we have learned and what the pandemic has brought us, but also look forward and see what structural changes and challenges are awaiting libraries in the future. And this is where EBLIDA and OCLC met because OCLC has conducted a research project with eminent library leaders to make an inventory of what happened and what we can expect. And EBLIDA has produced a report on the situation in Europe already in April 2020, and has updated that last month in August to the situation that is there now. So these two organizations, although different, they are complementary to one another, and bring their insights and experiences to you today. And OCLC, as most of you will know, is a global player in the library field. It is a not-for-profit membership organization, a cooperative that has WorldCat, which is important in the academic world, and the ILS WISE for public libraries, and also has a very famous motto, because what is known must be shared. And that sharing is what we will do today, and that is based on one of the other interesting and very fruitful aspects of OCLC, that there's a lot of research being done in the library world to move the library field ahead. EBLIDA, the other organization that is organizing this webinar and is presenting today, is the European Library Organization, with also a membership organization with members in national libraries, library association, and public libraries. And the focus of EBLIDA is mainly on public libraries, and EBLIDA wants to be and is the hub for exchange experiences between libraries in Europe, works of course on library legislation in all the different European countries, on copyright, which is an important issue, and on the sustainable development goals. And these development goals are not only addressing climate change, but also one other aspect, as we have seen in the pandemic, the free access to information, and now we should say to good or fact-checked information, because we have seen in the last year and a half a lot of false information going around. So um, that is the introduction on both the organizations. Um, our program consists of a part of presentations, starting with OCLC, then EBLIDA on their insights, and then there will be some discussion on questions, and of course, we have thought of some questions ourselves. We have prepared that. But I invite you really, if you have any question you want to ask, please do that in the chat. We will try to address as many as possible of these questions in the discussion we have at the end of this webinar. And if we can't do them all, I promise you that we will answer them later, so you will get a reply to your question anyway. And then it's my duty to make sure that after an hour and a half we wrap up and we all can get to our next businesses on time. So that is what we are awaiting on inspiration, and I wish us all a very fruitful meeting here. We start with a presentation by the colleagues of OCLC. It's, as I mentioned, an organization that does a lot of research, and three of their outstanding researchers, Brittany Brennan, Titia van der Werf, and Lynn Silipinyi Conaway, are going to join us today and present the results of the research project being conducted. And all three of them have outstanding careers with a lot of things that should be mentioned, but which I'm not going to do today because we are very limited in time. And I'd like to invite Lynn. Please, you are the first, if I understood correctly. Could you start the presentation and enrich us all with the insights you have developed in the project?
Thank you, Ton. And we will start the presentation in a minute. There we go. And so as Ton mentioned, I'm at OCLC Research, as are my colleagues Brittany and Titia. And we're here today to talk about a project titled The New Model Library. And this project was a collaboration between OCLC Research and our colleagues in market research. And as you can see from this picture of the pictures of the project team, that there are a lot of people who have been involved in this project, and it would not have been possible without them. And so the goal of this project was to identify the challenges and opportunities brought on by COVID-19. We were interested in how a group of library leaders responded to the pandemic and what new library models emerged as a result of the social and economic changes brought about or accelerated by the pandemic. And what we mean by a library model is the composition of what libraries are and how they function. And today we will give a very high-level summary of the changes that a group of library leaders made and what those changes might mean for the future. Now, to start off, we interviewed 29 library leaders from April 23rd through July 27th of 2020. These library leaders represented libraries from around the world, as you can see. 17 of our interviewees were at institutions in the Americas, 8 in Europe, 1 in the United Arab Emirates, and 3 in Asia Pacific. Now, the interviewees came from a variety of library types. 62% were from four-year academic institutions. So that includes research universities and 4-year colleges or universities, and also 2-year academic institutions, vocational college or technical colleges. There were 28% of them from public libraries, 7 public libraries, and 1 from a national library. So, what did we find out? Well, the themes that came up from the interviews fall into 3 areas that we're calling areas of experience. So we have the work experiences, the collection experiences, and the engagement experiences. And now Brittany will talk about the work experiences and what we learned.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you all for being here with us today. As Lynn said, I'm going to be discussing work experiences, and really that encompasses how work gets done in libraries, with an emphasis on library staff and their experience. So within the work experience, the new model library will focus on training for the future, making staff well-being a priority, embracing work flexibility, and rethinking organizational structures. Let's start with training for the future. Many libraries embraced the opportunity that the pandemic provided for their staff to focus on training, but many also realized that they were maybe catching up on training that had been neglected for a little bit too long. Moving forward, library staff will proactively train for emerging trends and skills, and it will be essential to ensure that adequate time and resources are provided for this training. Make staff well-being a priority. The pandemic foregrounded issues of mental, physical, emotional, and financial well-being in the workplace, which some libraries were better prepared to encounter and sort of work through than others. Moving forward, staff well-being will be an organizational priority to guide decision-making, communication, and organizational culture. Embrace work flexibility. Remote work became the norm for many during the pandemic, and library leaders anticipated that staff would demand greater work flexibility in all areas moving forward. Flexible work arrangements don't just mean remote working, but include flexibility in when, where, and how staff work. Including library staff in the process of creating flexible work arrangements will help to ensure equitable treatment without sacrificing the quality of library services. And finally, rethink organizational structures. Many libraries had to reassign staff to different roles or departments to accommodate the sudden shift to virtual and a sudden increase in work in particular library activities or areas. These temporary changes prompted a reconsideration of the organizational structure in libraries. This 4-year college library leader, for example, saw benefits to the library in removing departmental boundaries and working with more blended responsibilities across library staff. They illustrated this as once walls were down between departments, they could get more work done. So now we would like to hear from you. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for staff at your library as you move toward your new model? Is it in proactively training for emerging trends and skills, in rethinking organizational structure, in increased work flexibility, or in organizational prioritization of staff well-being? Or maybe it's none of the above. Please, as many of you are already doing, go ahead and respond to the poll. Select the option that you think best fits staff at your library. And if you select none of the above, we'd love to hear in the chat what you think the biggest opportunity for staff is. I see right now that work flexibility is our runaway leader, but training and rethinking organizational structure are also important for several of you. Yeah, so almost half have an emphasis on work flexibility moving forward. Over a quarter are thinking largely about training. Just under 20% thinking about organizational structure. Fantastic. And thank you all so much for participating in that. It's always interesting to us to see where priorities lie as people move through these different phases of the pandemic. I am now going to turn it over to Tizia to speak to you about collections experiences.
Thank you, Brittany. Yes, I will take over now to talk shortly about the collections experience. So, when we talked with the library leaders about how they see their new model library emerge in the wake of COVID-19 pressures, the collections came up quite a bit. In general, our interviewees found that the pandemic was accelerating the shift towards the library on demand, where users want resources immediately, conveniently, and in a format of their choosing. We have grouped the types of systemic changes mentioned in the following three categories: realize the full potential of digital resources, find new ways to connect the community to the print collection, and prioritize resources that close the digital divide. Firstly, libraries had to rapidly increase or enhance their digital online offerings. The demand for e-resources surged, and in particular, e-books and open educational resources were frequently asked for material types. This experience highlighted the importance for the new model library of embedding its acquisition and collection development in a larger strategy geared towards better serving the needs and preferences of the community. It highlighted the need to pay attention to the necessary infrastructure for seamless access, delivery, and use of online resources, and to plan budgeting for the corresponding operational costs. In short, it underscored the need to realize the full potential of digital resources. Secondly, libraries quickly implemented changes to maintain access to their print collection during the pandemic, and often through contactless pickup options managed by a small number of staff on site. Users took full advantage of these services, demonstrating that the convenience of connecting to the print collection without coming into the library was highly valued. This experience highlighted the opportunity for the new model library to shape its role of intermediary between physical collections and the online user, and to be creative in devising new ways to connect the community to the print collection, including those who do not want to access online resources or those who are unable to be online. Reimagining the physical space of the new model library is another opportunity area to meet the needs and expectations of the community. And thirdly, the increased independence on the online environment during the pandemic made the digital divide very visible. As library buildings closed, visitors lost the ability to use library resources on site. This created problems for users who do not have internet access and who do not own the device necessary to log in onto the network. The digital divide will remain and might even grow, and so the new model library needs to find ways to serve those in the community who do not have the tools and or the skills to operate online. This could be done by loaning or distributing for free connectivity kits and devices. The library could partner with IT providers and companies. There are already successful examples of such partnerships in the field. I wanted to highlight this quote from one of our interviewees, a university librarian from Spain, who said, "I think we should have to rethink what we are doing, the budget we invest on printed collections, and also things like withdrawals, and to create a policy for the collection management, more precise, more accurate to the needs of our users. This quote illustrates nicely how the pandemic brought home the idea that the new model library should shape its collection's experiences around community needs and adapt its budget allocations, its acquisitions, and collection development accordingly. So let's take the poll now. And please go ahead like you did with the first poll. And select any of the options here that are an answer to the question, which of these is your library's top priority? Realizing the full potential of digital resources, find new ways to connect the community to the print collection, prioritize resources that close the digital divide, or none of the above. There we go. The first one is still top priority. It's the realize the full potential of digital resources. And it's stabilizing with 37%. There comes the next one is the second, find new ways to connect the community to the print collection. And the third one is prioritize resources to close the digital divide. Nice and interesting results. Thank you so much for participating in the poll. And now I'd like to hand over to Lynn.
Thank you, Tizia and Brittany. And so I am going to talk about the engagement experiences. And what we learned is that library leaders really want to create equitable and inclusive spaces. What does that mean? Well, it can mean many things. It can be you really need to be present where the community lives, plays, and works. We heard examples of public libraries being in their community recreation centers. I know in our community we have a farmers market once a week, and the library staff have a table there at the farmers market. And I noticed that they're always talking and engaging with individuals within the community. We also learned that library staff were providing materials to homeless shelters and food pantries. So they would put magazines or newspapers or books or sometimes CDs or video recordings in the baskets with the food. With academic librarians, we learned that they would be in student dorms, in student unions, at the recreational facilities, the gymnasiums. So it's really about meeting the community where they actually spend their time and not expecting them to just come to the library. Also, we heard a lot about being strategic about going virtual. And I think you can tell how this came up within all of the engagement experiences. We heard it with the work experiences. We also heard it with the collection experiences. And with the engagement experiences, we did learn that library staff often are the leaders in teaching and learning, both within public libraries and academic libraries. Public libraries lead the community in adult education, literacy classes, language classes, and academic library staff have integrated their information literacy instruction into classes that are discipline specific. And also, library staff are very involved in helping people make sense of the world around them for their everyday life information seeking. And so we need to think again about where the individuals in our community actually live, work, and play. And we need to be there and think about how we can be there virtually and also in physically. And that's a challenge, as we all know. And so there's going to have to be a lot of decision making and assessment. The last one we heard a lot about was collaborate, advocate, and communicate. Collaborate with other libraries, with other agencies or departments within your community. Advocate how the library supports the mission, goals, and strategic plan of the communities. And really communicate, promote what we do. Let everyone know what you're offering in the virtual environment and also what you're offering in the physical environment, and that you're there and what resources you have. I really like this quote, and it's from a library leader in a four-year college in the US. But what I like about this is that whole idea of being accessible, being appealing, being useful, meeting needs in the online world, and also help with whatever devices that individuals are using at this point in time. And again, this is all about meeting your users and meeting their expectations, because they have very high expectations from what they're able to accomplish in their everyday lives. They can order materials online and have them delivered to their homes. They can order food. So these are all of the things that really set their expectations for the library. We have one more poll for you in our presentation. And so which of these will be the most important for your library in the near future? Collaboration and partnerships, virtual engagement, or equitable and inclusive physical spaces? Looks like collaboration and partnerships is the lead, which makes much sense. Well, thank you. It looks like first collaboration and partnerships, and then that virtual engagement. So during our interviews, library leaders were asked to describe what library models might emerge in 5 years as libraries continue to adapt to this new and changing environment. They did not describe a fully formed, cohesive model, but what did emerge from within the nuance and variation of each library's context were several broad themes which suggest directions for libraries to take. The discussions included the shift in staff responsibilities, flexible work schedules, staff well-being, the adaptation of the physical space of the library into a knowledge center or community hub, the enhancement of the library's virtual presence, the growth of digital materials, and the reduction of the handling of physical materials, the development and growth of the library's role in teaching and learning, the development of the library staff's leadership role in research support, and the importance of relationship building, partnerships, collaboration, advocacy, and communication. There are no universal right answers to these questions, nor are these really either-or options. These realignments reflect the degree of emphasis that best accommodates the needs and expectations of the communities they support. We expect that every library's set of choices, their new model library, will reflect to one degree or another a blend of the traditional and the new. It is also useful to point out that the choices discussed are not independent, but deeply interconnected. Staff, the library role, the library experience, collections, and engagement do not evolve on separate trajectories. Library leaders already were addressing many of these options. The choices discussed today were apparent to libraries before the pandemic, but as the library leaders we spoke to made clear, the pandemic experience often accelerated or even by necessity, pushed librarians into the process of making choices, and in some cases, helped clarify the implications of consequences of those choices. We encourage you to identify the changes that you already have made and then begin thinking about those identified today and if they are important to your communities, and if they are, how you will begin to integrate them into your new model library. So what's next? We will produce a report on our findings. We will have discussion groups, webinars, and virtual focus group interviews. Thank you so much for joining us, and we really are looking forward to hearing from you in the follow-up discussions.
Well, thank you, Lynn and Brittany and Titia, for this wonderful presentation. It can be found on the OCLC website, and I think it's very important that where some people were longing to go back to the old normal, that we use this pandemic to see how we can move forward and innovate library services, and that's what you have shown us. Thank you for that, and also for including us and giving us the opportunity to give our opinion on what is most important. And we sure will come back to this later when we have the questions and the discussion. Then now I like to move forward to the next presentation by Giuseppe Vitiello. Giuseppe is the director of EBLIDA since 2 years, and he has a very long career in library services and in the European environment, the Council of Europe, and he's very aware and informed about the European Union. So Giuseppe, please take us with you on the journey on what COVID meant in Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for giving me the floor. Thank you also to the OCLC for having offered EBLIDA this opportunity of having of speaking together about an issue, the post-COVID library agenda, which is definitely reorienting not only individual library agendas, but probably also library policies and in the near future. And my presentation is based on a report which was published by EBLIDA last year in May 2020. The title of the report was A European Library Agenda for the post-COVID-19 age. And it was quite successfully received, but also with some skepticism. And why? Because we were quite optimistic. We thought that the pandemic would come to an end at the end of the summer. Unfortunately, the pandemic is still with us. But now we can realistically say that we are at the end of the tunnel, and that therefore we can assess, and that was actually our concern. We assessed whether the conclusions that were drawn during in the first report were confirmed also 1 year later. The survey was sent to the library associations that are members of EBLIDA. EBLIDA is, for those who are not aware, stands for European Bureau of Library Information and Documentation Associations. We cover some 30 European countries, and we have 120 members. But the members that have a clear say on our policy are library associations. And we sent this survey to library associations because we consider that they are really the good focal point to collect opinions. And in fact, they came with very interesting opinions. And I said the survey was sent to library associations in February 2020. And this year, we started an update of the report that was published last year in May 2021. And we have constructed this presentation in such a way that you will express your opinion in polls, and then you will see whether your opinions confirm the opinions that have been expressed by library associations that themselves confirmed the result of the report of last year. So it's a kind of game like Russian puppets. So let's go now to the let's know now to the conclusions of the report. So these are the conclusions of the report published in last year, in May 2020. I do not summarize all the experiences, also because I think that most of the experiences have been reported by our friends and colleagues of OCLC. And in fact, I can only confirm what was said in the previous report. But certainly there were two directions, two policies. The first was the fast and impetuous development of the digital library, obviously. And the second was the fast and impetuous development of what I would call the socially inclusive library. Social inclusive library in all terms, actually, we are very much used to think that a social inclusive library is what we call the library as third place. But in general, we think that the library as third place is a place where people meet, so people come to the library. In this case, it was exactly the other way around. The library had to reach out people, their community, and so it was socially inclusive library in a very original way. In general, we came to these conclusions that you will find in the previous report and also in the update. I mean, the conclusions were confirmed that there was and there is still an exponential social distancing, so a well-connected 2-meter library, that was the picture. Technologies are mutating and shaping libraries in new ways, that there are uncharted economic territory, and that we should review the library budget composition, that we should also review the library governance at central and local levels, and then the last conclusions, but definitely not the least, do not forget the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So now I say that a socially inclusive library is something that was experienced during the COVID-19 by all librarians, because there was a great production, and in particular, a production that was made or aggregated, rather, information aggregated by the library associations about information, health information produced by governmental authorities, and this in order to fight fake news. Then there were community calls services, which were delivered from a very analog device, telephone, to very advanced instruments like platforms. Then there was an extremely wide use of social media to offer story time, also for library exchange and reuse of digital products. Then also a lot of services actually were provided to most vulnerable layers of population, in particular with storytelling. And then, there was something really which is really which tells you how librarians thought also what is unthinkable. The fact that some libraries for instance, in Lithuania, but also in France and Portugal, started to fabricate face masks through 3D printers. So, of course, this last activity will not continue, but in fact, what we asked the librarians then also in the report is what will happen actually, what will be the future actually of these new normals. What will happen in terms of library architecture, in terms of library security, And the focus is very much on a more flexible library. And this was well focused by previous colleagues, by my OCLC colleagues. So the question we asked actually Library Association was, and this will be the first poll I will propose you, were services implemented during the first pandemic outbreak, so in May 2020, also maintained in the months following May 2020? So please express your opinion. Well, I see that there is a crushing majority for a continuation of these new normals also after the pandemic was, if not over, at least less present in population. And in fact, if I look at the, and sorry, I'm coming back now to my presentation. If I look at the presentation, then you find actually I saw that it was more or less 90%. And in fact, you see that your opinion is confirmed by the library associations of some of them are the library associations of your countries. So yes, I mean there was a crushing majority for a yes. These services were confirmed also after the pandemic was not so present. Now I have another poll for you, which is: do you think that people read more or less during the pandemic, or do you think that there was no significant change? So thank you very much for responding and for responding so quickly and so numerous to these polls. I see that there are, I mean, that all of you actually are responding. If I look also at the number of attendants. So thank you for doing this. So I see that here again, you think that people read more, and but there is also a proportion of people who think that there was no significant changes. Actually, what we got from library associations is that people read more now. This is very good news because you know that there has been a negative trend in the last, I mean, in the years preceding the pandemic. Some of them actually consider that people read less, and some of them also that there was no significant change. So, I mean, so more or less, your opinion is confirmed by the opinion of library associations. Now I move to the next slide, and another conclusion, another new normal, was that the digital library boosted. Really, there was a boom of the digital library, not only in quantity but also in quality. There was a great number of new services that were offered, like self-learning, content on demand, music, press, e-books, and also in some libraries, workshops online, talk shows, lectures through live streaming. And what is interesting is that this boom was much more significant in public libraries than in academic libraries, and this is easy to understand. Because academic libraries have been digital and have worked digital for many years, whereas the digital library is something new for public libraries. But perhaps what is not, so this is in quality, but perhaps what is not really clear is to what extent actually was this digital library increasing so significantly. And this is actually the content of the next poll. Do you think that the digital library boosted at least in public libraries, 2 or 3 times more, less than 100%, or if you do not know, of course you write do not know. So what is your opinion? Very interesting, because percentages are moving all the time. And yes, I mean, we can say that more or less at the end of this, we have some 56% and 23%. So 56% say that digital services increased 2 or 3 times more. And then, so it's more or less a quarter and and a half, and then 21% doesn't know. Okay, so now let's see what is the opinion of library associations. And the opinion is that, in fact, in most of the countries, we are talking about European countries, because EBLIDA has a European scope, a geography, it covers only Europe. Well, in most of the public libraries, the digital library increased 2 or 3 times more than what was actually the development of digital resources before the pandemic. And but as you see, I mean, there is some 20% of the people who do not know. So these are the some very interesting remarks, and we can move. And you know that a digital library is okay. It's nice. I mean, it's an issue of technologies, but it's more also an issue of content. And if you want to have digital content in a digital libraries, you have to negotiate copyright contracts. You have to negotiate contracts with publishers, and there were significant and very interesting actually developments in copyright, because the two questions actually we ask now: will prices for digital publications level off in spite of the library's increasing demand? This is really a very hot question. And I would also like to mention an agreement between the National Library of Latvia and the Latvian Author Associations, which concerned both periodicals and books, which really made the digital library progress in that country. And so my question to you, and this is the content of next poll, is do you think that there were new forms of copyright contracts that were experienced during the pandemic? Very curious to know your opinion. So I would say that the proportion is 2/3 and 1/3, more or less. Yes. And in fact, if we go now to the slide, and thank you Sophie for helping me. If we go now to the next slide, we see actually that there was actually that plenty of some people actually say that there were new forms of agreements, but for most of them there was no change at all, which also means that there must be, as my colleague of OCLC said before, we must be strategic about going virtual, and also think of new forms of copyright, or have innovative ideas in this field. Some people actually regret that there were new forms of agreements, but they will terminate at the end of a pandemic, and they regret it because they fear, of course, that the increase and the boom of the digital library will come to an end. So now I go to other issues. So I come out. Oh, sorry. I gave you already an answer. So the other question we asked the library associations was, were library budgets affected during the pandemic? In fact, EBLIDA was very much concerned, because we say now that there is so much money that is used for health services, for vaccine, then there will be less money for culture. It is also true that when we asked the question in Europe, in European countries, there was not yet actually all these moves of resilience, the new plans that really have changed the economic phase of Europe, and also the human and social phase of Europe. So, but I'm very interested in your question because you can talk about your own experience. Has the pandemic affected your the library budget of your library? So this is the content of next poll. So you have three answers. Yes, substantially, in a moderate way, and no change at all. So I'm very interested in having your opinion. And in fact, I'm not sure if probably we are at the end of the poll. And in fact, actually, our concerns, we were very pleased to see that where our concerns were ungrounded, because when we asked library associations, then we found out that there was actually most of the libraries were not affected economically by the pandemic, or at least there was no. They were affected, but in a moderate way. So we were actually, as a library association, as a EBLIDA, we were very, very relieved from this response, which we received only a couple of months ago. So now we can see that libraries can move ahead with a renewed experience and especially with some cash to feed their renewed hopes and some cash to feed these hopes. So library budgets did not suffer in 2021. Nevertheless, we feel that libraries remain vulnerable, and because we found out, and this was one of the results of the report, that library income is almost exclusively generated at the local level, and it has also a very inelastic nature, because the bulk of the library budget is for personnel. And so there must be diversification of funding for libraries in order to fund new activities. And in particular, it goes the two ways. Part of the money should be used to promote the new framework of the European 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But it is also true the other way around, that the European money actually came from the sustainable development. The European money can fund libraries. And in fact, this is why EBLIDA focused on European structural and investment funds. And I would like to, what is also interesting is that libraries during the pandemic cooperated actually quite intensively with the non-cultural and non-educational agencies, so with NGOs, especially in the social field and also in the private sector. And also, another question, the other normal, was library governance at central and local levels. And here there is a very interesting, actually, conclusion, because on the one hand, we saw two divergent directions. On the one hand, there is a need for a more coordinated services, more centralized services, also for public libraries, because digital services require centralized library governance, and in particular when we come to the negotiations with publishers. But on the other hand, we also saw a direction, is also a development towards a more uncoordinated and spontaneous movement with joint enterprises with library associations and with non-governmental organizations, and where library associations were often taking the lead. So there is perhaps in library governance in order to open them to more advanced forms of cooperation. And I think this also emerged from the report that was published by OCLC. We thought also that since there were less cars increasing, then this was a good year for the 2030 agenda. But this was not really the case. So I would like to come to an end and to say that EBLIDA is providing consultancy services for our members on, in particular, on European structural funds. And we have published a guide for library applicants who want to within funds. If you are interested, you will find reports, find this very practical guide, which will help you to attract, for your libraries, funding for sustainable development activities. And I've come to the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention, and thank you also for the input you provided. As you see, your input was very much in line with that of your library associations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Giuseppe, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm afraid, at least I had at the end, there was some problem with the sound of your presentation, but I think everyone can find at the EBLIDA website the information on the SDGs and why we think for libraries in Europe it is important not only to work on the SDGs but also apply for funding from the European Union to give a broader base to the financial position of the library. And well, maybe next time we could do the poll not with the Library Association but with this audience, because it shows how aligned the library world is in its thinking. So thank you for that. We now move to 3 questions that were prepared in advance. And the first question, well, it's on the screen. As a result of how the pandemic has foregrounded inequities, could you describe how the role of the library in the community has changed? So I would like to start to ask Lynn if she would be willing to address this question.
Yes.
I hope I don't surprise you with that too much.
No, thank you, Ton. Well, as we discussed in the research findings, and both Giuseppe and the OCLC group talked about some of the inequities that that the pandemic has really, I think, called more attention to. And some of the things that we heard were how the librarians are offering program services and collections to promote awareness and education around diversity. Also, how the libraries were really a welcoming place, and we're also going to other community agencies and settings. And also within equities, there was some discussion about accessibility in our physical buildings as well as with our website. So that's another thing to think about. And then OCLC, the Global Council, had their area of focus for FY21 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we asked individuals to, and we had 1,700 responses from public and academic and other types of libraries, national government, corporate libraries. And they were also respondents, again, from the Americas, Asia Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. And what we heard was one of the top 5 SDGs where individuals thought that that libraries could make an impact was the SDG 10, which is reduced inequalities. And some of the things that came up in the survey was that the activities that are happening are providing inclusive facilities. So that's the gender neutral restrooms, the physically accessible facilities. Also, many of them said 49% of academic librarians said they did this regularly. And they also talked about promoting awareness of their program services and collections around diversity. And some of the other things that came out were employee training around equity, diversity, and inclusion, implementing policies to ensure diverse leadership, implementing services or programs to reduce inequalities, and implementing vocabularies and metadata policies designed to reduce bias. Public libraries, the most common activity to reduce inequalities was to offer programs, services, or collections, again, to promote awareness and education around diversity. They also, in public libraries, offered the training. They also implemented policies and for diverse staffing. And they implemented services or programs designed to reduce inequality. And this was, this came up in our interviews. We did not ask this question specifically. We had very broad questions about what changes were made with the library that the library leaders had to make, and how these changes, what changes they thought would continue and how they would affect their new model library. And I think, again, it's this more focused awareness of these issues of inequities. And then with this survey that we did, this also, for a different project, it also fit very nicely in with what we were hearing in the new model library. So I will turn it over now so that Giuseppe has some time to talk about this, and I'm happy to answer any questions that others may have.
Oh, thank you so much, and it's an impressive list of the practices in libraries on this topic. So I hope Giuseppe has some more reflections on it, but please go ahead, Giuseppe.
Yeah, well, I don't want to use much time because I see that time goes quite fast, and also because I have a very short answer. The short answer is please come on 23rd of November to one of the workshop seminars that we will organize together with the Berlin Senate, where we will present actually a pre-synthesis, not really the synthesis, a pre-synthesis of the second European report on sustainable development and libraries. But I can anticipate. We have received so many data, so many projects, so many policies, really, that now it's a little bit difficult to process them. We are doing this in collaboration with the National Library of Latvia. And however, I can anticipate what really I felt personally between the first and the second European report. In the first report, actually, there was a lot of enthusiasm, but no clear data. In the second report, actually, we had a very precise, perhaps in spite of the pandemic, or perhaps because of the pandemic, we received very precise data. For instance, every country, and you will see this in the country profile, every country has set up a policy with a selection of SDGs to pursue. So it's not only SDG 4, which is logical, it's not only SDG 10, as Lynn mentioned, but also a series of SDGs, and this really defines the library policy in the country. And then, of course, there are plenty of projects which cover, but I think the most important conclusion of the second report, and again, I'm anticipating, it's that there is libraries are conscious that SDGs are starting to represent the new framework for libraries. It's not only libraries are not only operating within a cultural field or within an educational field, but I think the pandemic really raised awareness on the fact that the library have a social impact, and therefore the new framework for libraries, a new appropriate framework, is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's wonderful to hear that there is awareness about this, and that has increased by the pandemic. There is a framework, but also in the examples Lynn gave, there is practice in libraries, and that is very together. That sounds like a policy that will bear fruit, and it's also very inspiring to hear that. So thank you for this. Then we move to the second question. What are the opportunities for libraries to provide and promote open content to their communities? For example, create and assist community members with the creation, digitization, advertise, promote, etc. And I'd like to invite Titia to give her opinion on this question.
Thank you, Ton. Yes. So if I stick to our findings from the interviews with library leaders, it's true that the pandemic has opened up new opportunities to promote open content. And in particular, what the interviewees mentioned were efforts to achieve breakthroughs in the negotiations with publishers. So that's also something that Giuseppe has mentioned, because online access to resources suddenly became so much more important because of the pandemic. And this meant for many libraries that they needed to acquire and license content with much more urgency. And this exposed, in turn, the high costs of licensing and maintaining access to ebooks in particular. So the need to negotiate for more affordable licensing terms became a top priority for library leaders. And they mentioned that working collectively in consortia to license ebooks is proving effective, and that it has become more important to them. So in this context, they said, and that's interesting in terms of open content. In this context, they also mentioned that they are negotiating with publishers to expand the choice of open ebook content. So that's one of the contexts in which open content is becoming more important. There is another context, and that is the online education, which was really boosted during the pandemic. And that has raised much awareness of the importance of open educational resources as an opportunity for the future in online education. Thirdly, there was also mention of increased digitization of physical resources, again, referring to the library on demand. And there is much less reservations concerning the digitization of special collection items. What I wanted to mention also in the context of this question is that libraries are also cautious when it comes to promoting open content. So this became especially clear with when our interviewees mentioned the content that is normally paywalled, but that was made available for free just after the start of the pandemic. So for example, the e-resources made available by GStore, the Internet Archive, Overdrive, Hoopla, ProQuest, HathiTrust. Library leaders said that they found this temporary easing of the access barriers helpful, and most have taken advantage of it, but they also expressed concerns because these measures were temporary and therefore problematic, because this creates unrealistic expectations on the part of faculty and students. And we had some extreme examples of this. One of the interviewees, for example, at an academic library in Europe, explained that publisher negotiations have become much more difficult because now the university is no longer prepared to pay anything anymore for published content. So she said, we just want everything for free now. And at the other extreme, another interviewee at an academic library in North America mentioned that they were turning down offers for free course material because they didn't want to set expectations for faculty that they couldn't maintain after the summer period when publishers would put their free content offerings behind the paywall again. So it's interesting to see, the different reactions to the opportunities offered by the pandemic. And you have those who prefer to follow a controlled evolutionary path to open access, but you also have examples of those who jump to the opportunity to take a more, let's say, revolutionary approach.
Thank you, Titia, for, at least giving a top priority. I think libraries already had some, but this is a very important as well. Giuseppe, do you have
Yes,
additional?
I mean, the Budapest Open Access Declaration dates 2002, so 20 years ago, and it concerns scientific journals. It was about articles, scientific articles. Now, when we come to ebooks and to books in digital form, then there must be a kind of more overall reflection about copyright, about the author's rights, and of course, free access to information. And this overall reflection should be also focused on the way of distributing them. I mean, there are plenty of publishers who do not have the resources to go digital, and there are plenty of libraries who have the resources to go digital, and they went digital indeed, but they do not have any content to offer, or they do not know which content they can offer, because exactly as Titia was saying, they are afraid that then this open access content will become paid for content. So in order to feed, let's say, open access policies, then there must be a balance between paid for resources, so negotiations with publishers, but also there should be a way of producing open access resources. And this also comes with, let's say, two aspects. On the one hand, it's exactly what was said in the report. On one hand, there is a centralized digital approach to the digital library, because it is founded on negotiations with publishers. But on the other hand, there must be a decentralized development of the digital library in order to get the most out of the communities libraries refer to. So I don't know whether I was clear, but definitely there are two aspects: copyright on the one hand, and the architecture of the digital library. And I think we should really explore both aspects.
Okay, thank you very much. I regret we don't have time to go deeper into this because it's a big topic and it's complex. And I think there's a lot of colleagues who are willing to learn more about this. But we have to move to our third question. And we are here together today with two cooperatives. They they try to serve libraries, and what challenges and opportunities are there for the library membership cooperatives. Brittany, would you please start?
Absolutely. So, like Titia, I'm going to sort of focus primarily on what we heard from library leaders as we talked with them. And I think there are a few things that stand out to me as things that individual library leaders discussed as challenges they were facing that really can be better addressed at this collective level. Tizia and Giuseppe were just talking about a lot of the issues and challenges around e-resource access, e-resource provision, that I think is a really important issue. But again, in interest of time, I don't think we want to rehash that here. So the first one that I'll discuss is really around advocacy. And Tone, you discussed at the beginning some of the work that EBLIDA is doing around advocacy at the legislative level. And I think that's really important. But what we found was that libraries are typically quite good at developing collaborative relationships and building collaborations both with other libraries and with other departments or agencies in their local areas. We also found that libraries spend a lot of time talking to one another about the issues that are important to them. But what they maybe don't do quite as well is to advocate for themselves, either directly within their institution or at the sort of policy level. And what I want to sort of clarify here is that what I mean by that in terms of advocating for themselves is that sort of direct communication with people who have decision-making power to really promote libraries' interests and values. So what we found, and this seems that it may be slightly different in Europe, which is really kind of great news to hear, is that most libraries were already operating on reduced budgets and reduced levels of staffing, and that they really anticipated that that was going to get worse rather than better in the coming months. Additionally, some of the things that they were facing, things like providing internet access within their communities, things like addressing homelessness crises, they're really things that require change at that legislative or policy level to effectively address. They're things that libraries can provide help with as sort of stopgap measures, but really can't solve. So I think there's a real opportunity for membership cooperatives to help libraries advocate for themselves, but also to help them advocate for issues that are important to them and their communities. The second one that I see really is around training. So we saw a huge spike in training and professional development at the beginning of the pandemic, and that was driven by a number of factors. But what we saw was that most libraries were really relying on training materials provided through membership cooperatives to make that happen. And I think that's a really valuable thing to continue to provide. But we had one library leader that also talked about their desire for agenda setting around what types of training and professional development should be prioritized. So I think that there's a real opportunity for membership cooperatives who have a little bit of a broader view of the field. You know, as Giuseppe was talking about, EBLIDA has this sort of really wide view of what libraries and library associations across Europe are prioritizing. And so it really is a great moment to help provide some guidance around what kinds of training and professional development are important, and even to help facilitate that kind of agenda setting among libraries. So I'm going to turn that over to Giuseppe now. I'm sure he has some equally interesting things to say about this.
I think that it's the moment to listen to the audience, and I think that I have nothing to add to what you already said.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I see a question by Ulla Wester. She says she has one question, but I think it's more than one. Are there any findings regarding the change of cities during the pandemic due to mobile working, escape to rural areas, relatively deserted inner cities, and the new role of libraries in the city regarding architecture, interior design as inclusive spaces for meeting, connecting to each other, inspiration and creativity in a much more digital world? Now, that's maybe a bit early to see the effects on the architecture and design, because these processes normally take a lot of time. But would any one of you like to comment on this question? Because I think it's puzzling all of us.
Yeah, if I may, I mean, of course, there are some effects like, when you are in the lift, instead of touching the button, you say third floor, and then you go to the third floor. But I mean, these are really, this is in the air. But what I found is very, very interesting is the discussion about the library as third place, because in order to get as many people as possible, we emptied the libraries of books. We created large spaces in the libraries so that people could meet, or even ad hoc spaces. So this was an effect of the library as third place concept on architectural buildings. But now, for a library that goes beyond its walls, what will be the effect? I have no answers, but definitely this is a question that should be asked to architects.
Okay, thank you. Brittany, you like to comment on this one as well?
Sure. I think just to sort of respond to the first part of that, we don't have any findings directly related to the difference between cities and rural areas. So I don't know that we can speak sort of directly to that piece of it. But we did hear a lot about library spaces, and particularly the challenges that Giuseppe was just talking about in terms of these spaces that were really built for gathering. Um, One of the things that I think was a real emphasis for the leaders that we talked to was the ability to provide spaces for vulnerable populations, people who didn't have other places to go or who didn't have access to things like technology if they weren't in the library, and that there was a real emphasis on being able to provide that again in a way that was safe both for library users and library staff. So I think that that's a really important part of what's happening here, is that, you know, library leaders were starting to kind of look around and see who was being hit the hardest, who was really struggling without access to the library resources, and how do they continue to provide those. And I do think that there are likely some differences happening there in terms of a sort of city versus rural divide, but we don't have anything that specifically addresses those.
Thank you for that. Lynn, Titia, you want to add something to this question? If not, I like to mention that if we take traffic jams as a measure for how we are getting back to where we were, then in the Netherlands they are increasing more and more to the normal level. So I think people want to go to the office, work less from home as they did, etc. But we don't know if it will stop at a different level than it was before. But there is an increase. Then there is, I switched off my camera because I saw my background was very moving. So that's unrest. Maya Benson asks, should libraries start creating a digital third space, start planning what kind of design and which kinds of activities it should include? Now that's an interesting question, also in the light that, the experts say that you always need a combination of a physical third space and digital things. But what should a digital third space include, in your opinion? And should libraries start planning to make that? Anyone?
If I may, I don't have a precise answer, but I would like to make an example. One of the activities that are socially inclusive are the activities towards migrants, for instance. And of course, one of the activities that at least public libraries provide is language teaching. Language teaching is a very interesting example of negotiations with publishers, because there are very elaborated language courses and they are very, very expensive. So on the one hand, there is this centralized negotiation. But on the other hand, actually, the production of courses is done also at migrants level in classes. And this is really a wonderful digital third place, because if the content of these courses is added to the, let's say, to a platform providing language courses, then this is really a very, very interesting addition. So I found this question really central. I don't have an answer, an overall answer, but this is why I just made an example.
Lynn, would you reflect on this? Or Titia?
Yeah, Titia, did you want to say anything?
Well, I have the impression that there is so many opportunity to think about, a digital third space for libraries, but it's not something that really came from our new model library interviews, so it's difficult to react to this question. But obviously, a digital space where your community can have a public debate, where you can have all kinds of digital support for activities that you normally physically have, which Giuseppe mentioned, like language courses. There are many, many opportunities. I love this question, and I love the previous question as well. They're so nicely future-oriented. Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And as I mentioned before, we have this book by Putnam, Bowling Alone. And in the 2020 edition, he writes something about that third places can't exist only digital. There has always has to be a kind of physical community. So if we build this platform, then we should connect it to real communities of people, I guess. I must unfortunately say that we have come to the end of this webinar, and I try to summarize a bit in the conclusions. For those who think I missed something, you can check it out because this session is recorded, and we will announce where you can find the recording of this session, so you can look it back. I think that with the new model library, OCLC has given us a lot to think about. I think one main aspect is that there has been a kind of awareness, a kind of resetting our thinking of the library, that, well, we were doing the things the way we did, and now we had to rethink why do we do this, and is this the best way, and how can we adapt to new situations and new user groups. I think that's very valuable. We also noticed that we are thinking of using our staff in a more flexible way. There seems to be support for that idea. Well, we are librarians, so when it comes to collections, we want it all. We want to connect the physical collection. We want to close the digital divide, and we want to check out the full potential of the digital collections. And when it comes to engagement, cooperation and partnerships are very important in libraries. That's a summary that doesn't do justice to all what you've said, but at least it's a part of it. Then Giuseppe, he addressed the social inclusive library, and also the rise of the digital libraries. I think that one of the things that will last is probably not the copyright contracts that were possible during the pandemic, but the increase in digital services will remain. And what we also learned is that the pandemic created much more awareness and a lot of good practices on sustainable development goals, created a top priority for libraries on negotiating better license contracts, and well, it also showed that the strategies of how to get there, libraries are divided on that part. The route is not clear yet, and we also see that libraries are doing the good things, but as Brittany said, they have to do better in their advocacy and show it how they do it. And for organizations like EBLIDA and OCLC, there is a role in supporting on training and other things that could be done cooperatively in libraries. So I think that's a great takeaway from this afternoon in our time zone. Others can enjoy a wonderful day with these fruits and or go to sleep with it. I thank all the attendees for being with us and investing their time with us. And I would like to invite them, if it's possible, to unmute and give a very big applause for the people who presented today this wonderful information: Titia, Lynn, Giuseppe, and last but not least, Brittany. So, well, thank you all, and we will meet again. I'm sure there's a lot to think about, and we have to work further on this. I thank Sophie and Magella and Giuseppe for organizing the technical parts, and we will continue another time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.